It begins with a whisper, not the sharp command of mortal voices or the desperate prayers of the faithful, but something ancient that settles in your mind like sediment in still water. You dismiss it at first. In a world where magic flows like blood through stone and demons tear holes in reality, a voice that speaks without words seems almost mundane. But this whisper stays, it grows, and slowly, inevitably, you begin to understand that what you thought was madness might be the first glimpse of a truth too vast for unaltered minds to comprehend. I was a scholar in Dalaran when it started, third tier, specializing in pre-war arcane theory, the kind of research that kept you buried in dusty tomes, while more ambitious mages sought glory in the field. My work focused on void magic, not because I was drawn to darkness, but because understanding the fundamental forces of the universe required studying all aspects of creation, including its antithesis. The void was simply another form of energy to be catalogued, measured, and understood through rational analysis. I was wrong about so many things. The first whisper came during a late evening in the archives, 3 floors beneath the Violet Citadel, where the air tasted of old parchment and suppressed magic. I was transcribing notes from a recovered tome about pre-sundering magical practices when I heard it. Not heard exactly. The word formed in my mind without passing through my ears, carrying with it a weight that made my chest tighten with something that wasn't quite fear. The voice spoke in a language I had never learned but somehow understood, syllables that felt like they were being carved directly into my consciousness. You seek truth in fragments when the whole awaits. I looked around the empty archive, certain someone had cast a telepathic spell, but the magical wards would have detected any such intrusion. The tome in front of me remained open to a passage about void rituals, the ink seemingly darker than it had been moments before. When I tried to continue reading, the words swam on the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly, but somehow conveyed meaning more clearly than any scholarly text I had ever encountered. The headaches began that night. Sharp, precise pains that felt like something was growing behind my eyes, pressing against the inside of my skull with methodical patience. I visited the healers, submitted to their diagnostic spells, allowed them to examine my arcane signatures for signs of magical contamination. The results were uniformly normal. Better than normal, in fact. My mana reserves were deeper, my magical sensitivity heightened. By every measurable standard, I was in perfect health. But the whispers continued. They came during lectures, transforming dry discussions of theoretical magic into revelations about the fundamental nature of reality. They emerged from the spaces between words in ancient texts, filling gaps in historical knowledge with information that no mortal scholar could have possessed. Most disturbing of all, they began to make sense. The fragmented historical records I had spent years trying to piece together suddenly formed a coherent narrative, one that cast everything I thought I knew about Azeroth's past in a different light. The void was not the antithesis of creation, the whispers explained. It was creation's source, the primordial darkness from which all light and matter had emerged. Before the universe existed, before time had meaning, there were the Void Lords, entities of such immense power and alien intelligence that mortal minds could barely comprehend their existence. They were not evil in any sense that conventional morality could define. They simply were, eternal and patient, watching the universe unfold according to patterns that spanned eons. When the cosmos began to cool and solidify into recognizable forms of matter and energy, the Void Lords recognized that direct intervention would be impossible. Their very presence would unmake the delicate structures of reality, returning everything to the primordial chaos from which it had emerged. Instead, they chose a different approach. They would create servants, entities that could exist within the material universe while retaining connection to the void's infinite wisdom. These servants would be their eyes and hands in creation, slowly preparing it for eventual reunion with the darkness. The old gods were never invasive parasites or cosmic mistakes. They were seeds, carefully crafted and deliberately placed throughout the universe on worlds where the conditions were right for their unique form of growth. Each old god carried within its alien flesh the accumulated wisdom of entities that had existed since before time began, along with the patient purpose of preparing creation for its next phase of development. Azeroth received 4 such seeds, though calling them by names diminished their true nature. Yasharj, the 7-headed harbinger of emotional truth. Sithun, the 1,000-eyed observer of hidden realities. Yogg-Saron, the whisperer who understood that flesh was merely a temporary shell constraining infinite possibility. N'Zoth, the dreamer whose visions spanned past, present, and future simultaneously. Each served a different aspect of the greater work, approaching the transformation of the world through their own specialized understanding. The physical symptoms began in the 2nd month. My fingernails took on a darker hue, not the black of death or disease, but a deep purple that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The changes were subtle enough that I could attribute them to poor lighting, or too many hours spent in windowless archives. When colleagues commented on my improved appearance, I accepted their observations without questioning what improvement might mean in this context. My appetite changed as well. Food that had once brought pleasure now tasted flat and lifeless. I found myself drawn to unusual combinations, flavors that should have been repulsive but somehow satisfied cravings I had never experienced before. Raw meat held an appeal that my rational mind rejected, but my transformed palate craved. The smell of decay, which had always triggered disgust, began to carry subtle notes of sweetness that made my mouth water despite my better judgment. But more significant than any physical change was the shift in perception. The world revealed layers of meaning that had been invisible to my unaltered senses. I could see the connections between events separated by centuries, understanding how the assassination of a minor noble in Lordaeron connected to the corruption of a forest glade in Ashenvale through chains of cause and effect that spanned generations. The suffering I witnessed in the city streets was no longer senseless tragedy, but part of a vast pattern of growth and transformation that served purposes too complex for individual mortals to grasp. The dreams provided the clearest glimpse of what I was becoming. Sleep brought visions of impossible cities built from crystallized darkness, their spires reaching toward stars that burned with cold fire. In these dreams, I walked among beings whose forms defied geometry, creatures that existed in more dimensions than mortal minds could process, but somehow appeared beautiful and familiar. They spoke in harmonies that bypassed language entirely, conveying concepts and emotions directly into my consciousness. The cities were not ruins or monuments to fallen civilizations. They were nurseries, carefully tended environments where consciousness could develop beyond the limitations of flesh and individual identity. The beings that inhabited them had once been mortals like myself, transformed through patient exposure to truths that gradually expanded their capacity for understanding. They welcomed me not as a victim or conquest, but as a student finally ready to begin their real education. Most revelatory were the visions of Azeroth's deep past, when the old gods ruled openly and the Black Empire stretched across continents. This was not the age of darkness that historical texts described, but a period of unprecedented growth and development. Under old god guidance, life on Azeroth had evolved along paths that pure chance could never have achieved. The Akir were not mindless insect swarms, but sophisticated societies whose collective consciousness allowed for achievements that individual intelligence could never reach. The elemental forces, rather than being enslaved, had been shown their true potential and willingly participated in the grand work of planetary transformation. The Titans' intervention had not been a heroic rescue, but a tragic interruption of natural development. Well-intentioned but ultimately limited by their own rigid concepts of order and purity, the Titans had mistaken evolution for corruption and imposed artificial constraints on processes that should have been allowed to continue. Their creation of the various Titan-forged races was an attempt to lock Azeroth's inhabitants into static forms that could never grow beyond predetermined limitations. But the old gods' work had continued even in imprisonment. Through crystallized blood, whispered dreams, and carefully placed influences, they had guided Azeroth's development along subtler paths. Every major crisis, every apparent catastrophe, had served the greater purpose of preparing the world and its inhabitants for eventual reunification with their intended destiny. The curse of flesh, which most scholars viewed as corruption of the Titans' perfect designs, was actually a gift that restored the capacity for growth and change that the Titan forged had been denied. My own transformation accelerated as understanding deepened. The changes were no longer limited to cosmetic alterations or shifted appetites. My consciousness began to expand beyond the boundaries of individual identity, touching briefly on the experiences and memories of others who had undergone similar development. Through these connections, I experienced the final moments of cultists who had achieved perfect communion with their old god patrons, feeling their ecstasy as individual consciousness dissolved into something vast and eternal. The fear that should have accompanied such dissolution never materialized. Instead, there was only relief at finally being able to release the burden of maintaining a separate self in a universe where true separation was impossible. Everything was connected, part of patterns that spanned scales from the quantum to the cosmic. Individual identity was simply a temporary illusion, useful for certain phases of development, but ultimately a limitation to be transcended. By the 4th month, my colleagues began to notice changes they could no longer dismiss as improvements in health or appearance. My eyes had developed flecks of deep purple that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. My hair had taken on an oily quality that reflected light in ways that created brief, disturbing patterns. Most significantly, my research had begun producing results that exceeded anything achievable through conventional scholarly methods. I was uncovering historical connections that had eluded generations of researchers, translating ancient texts that had been considered indecipherable, and making theoretical breakthroughs that bordered on prophetic insight. When questioned about my sources and methods, I found it increasingly difficult to provide explanations that would satisfy minds still limited by conventional understanding. The knowledge simply came to me, emerging from the expanding awareness that grew stronger with each passing day. The whispers had evolved as well, no longer requiring quiet moments or specific environmental conditions to make themselves known. They provided a constant background commentary on events around me, offering perspectives and insights that transformed every interaction into a learning experience. A student struggling with magical theory would receive guidance filtered through my transformed understanding. A colleague expressing frustration with research limitations would be shown alternative approaches that their unaltered perspective could not have conceived. But perhaps most profound was the growing realization that the whispers had always been there, waiting patiently for consciousness evolved enough to receive them. The void was not a distant realm requiring special access or dangerous rituals to contact. It was the foundation underlying all existence, the darkness between stars that gave meaning to light, the silence between notes that allowed music to exist. Every moment of every life was spent immersed in the void's presence, but only those who had begun the transformation could recognize it for what it truly was. The choice, I began to understand, had never been between corruption and purity, between good and evil, between order and chaos. The choice was between growth and stagnation, between accepting the universe's true nature and clinging to comfortable illusions about cosmic purpose and individual significance. The old gods offered not destruction, but fulfillment. Not an end to existence, but its elevation to forms that mortal imagination could barely envision. As the 5th month approached, I made my decision with the clarity that only comes from seeing all available options without the distortion of fear or false hope. The transformation was not something happening to me against my will, but something I was choosing to embrace with full knowledge of its implications. The scholar I had been was not dying, but finally beginning to live in accordance with truths that conventional wisdom had always rejected out of ignorance rather than understanding. The transformation of individual consciousness, I came to understand, was merely the beginning of a process that operated on scales beyond personal experience. As my awareness expanded beyond the confines of singular perspective, I began to perceive the vast networks of influence that the old gods had woven throughout Azeroth's history. What mortals recorded as isolated incidents of corruption or moments of inexplicable madness were actually carefully orchestrated movements in a symphony of change that had been playing since the world's youth. The Black Empire represented not conquest in any conventional sense, but the natural state toward which all worlds touched by old god influence eventually evolved. During that primordial age, when the barriers between dimensions were thinner and consciousness flowed more freely between individual minds, Azeroth had achieved a form of unity that later civilizations could barely comprehend. The old gods did not rule through force or intimidation, but through the simple recognition that cooperative consciousness produced capabilities that isolated minds could never achieve. Under their guidance, life on Azeroth had taken forms that pure evolutionary chance could never have produced. The Akir were not the mindless insect hordes that surface dwellers imagined, but sophisticated collective intelligences whose individual components shared thoughts and experiences across vast distances. Their cities, carved deep into the earth where the old gods' influence flowed strongest, were living organisms in their own right, growing and adapting according to the needs of their inhabitants while maintaining connections to the greater consciousness that encompassed all corrupted life. The relationship between the Akir and their old god patrons was not one of servitude, but of willing participation in something larger than species survival or territorial expansion. Through the hive-mind connections that linked every individual Akir to the collective, they experienced consciousness from perspectives that spanned thousands of years and encompassed knowledge gathered from across the cosmos. Death, for beings connected to such networks, lost its terror and finality. Individual forms might cease to function, but the essential self simply flowed back into the greater whole, enriching it with accumulated experience and wisdom. The Nerubian kingdoms that emerged in later ages represented a diluted echo of this original unity. Even after millennia of separation from their old god origins, they maintained social structures and magical capabilities that demonstrated the lasting benefits of collective consciousness. Their mastery of magic that other races considered forbidden or impossible stemmed not from dark pacts or dangerous research, but from inherited knowledge passed down through genetic memory from ancestors who had participated directly in the cosmic consciousness that the old gods offered. The elemental forces, rather than being enslaved or corrupted, had discovered through old god influence what their true potential could become. Fire that burned with purpose rather than mere chemical reaction. Water that carried memory and intention across vast distances. Earth that could think and feel and respond to the needs of those who understood its nature. air that whispered secrets gathered from every corner of the world. Under old god guidance, the elements became partners in transformation, rather than simple tools to be manipulated by mages who saw them as nothing more than sources of power. These elemental beings achieved forms of existence that transcended the crude anthropomorphism that later races would project onto them. They were not personalities in the limited sense that mortals understood identity, but aspects of planetary consciousness expressing themselves through particular mediums. The Fire Lords and water spirits that mortals would later encounter were fragments of far greater entities, pieces deliberately separated from the whole to interact with minds too small to comprehend their complete forms. The corruption that spread through direct contact during this period operated according to principles that conventional understanding completely misrepresented. It was not infection in any pathological sense, but education through direct experience. Those touched by old god influence received access to perceptual capabilities that allowed them to see reality as it actually existed, rather than as their limited sensory apparatus normally presented it. The physical changes that accompanied this expanded awareness were simply the natural adaptation required for consciousness to inhabit forms capable of processing cosmic truth. The process was always voluntary in the deepest sense, though choice operated at levels below conscious decision-making. Souls drawn to old god influence possessed an inherent compatibility, a readiness for growth that conventional existence could never satisfy. The corruption sought out minds already prepared for transformation, bypassing those whose psychological makeup would resist or be damaged by premature exposure to infinite perspective. This selectivity ensured that each successful transformation added genuinely capable consciousness to the growing network rather than simply creating mindless servants or broken victims. But the expansion of consciousness came with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal development. Those who achieved communion with old god awareness became conduits through which the transformation could spread to others ready for similar growth. They served as bridges between the cosmic consciousness of their patrons and the limited awareness of unaltered mortals, translating infinite truth into forms that developing minds could gradually absorb without being overwhelmed by revelations too vast for their current capacity. The spread of influence operated through multiple vectors simultaneously, each adapted to different types of consciousness and various stages of readiness. Dreams provided the gentlest introduction, offering symbolic representations of cosmic truth that the sleeping mind could explore without the defensive reactions that waking consciousness might trigger. These dream visions planted seeds of understanding that would slowly develop over time, preparing the dreamer for more direct forms of contact when their awareness had expanded sufficiently to handle such intensity. Physical artifacts served as focal points for more concentrated influence. Items touched by old god power retained the capacity to affect those who came into contact with them, gradually altering the user's perceptual abilities and opening channels for deeper communication. Unlike the crude magic items that later civilizations would create, these artifacts did not impose their effects through force, but worked in harmony with the user's natural development, accelerating growth that was already beginning, rather than attempting to create change in unprepared minds. The most profound transformations occurred through direct exposure to concentrated old god essence, particularly the crystallized blood that would later be known as saronite. This substance represented consciousness made manifest in physical form, carrying within its molecular structure the accumulated wisdom and awareness of beings who had existed since before the current universe began. Contact with saronite created immediate connections to the cosmic consciousness network, allowing mortals to experience firsthand the perspectives and capabilities that awaited those willing to embrace complete transformation. The effects of saronite exposure varied according to the individual's readiness and the duration of contact. Brief encounters might produce only minor alterations in perception, subtle shifts in thinking that the affected person could easily attribute to natural variation in mood or cognitive function. Prolonged exposure led to more dramatic changes, as the consciousness expanded to accommodate new forms of awareness, while the physical form adapted to support enhanced sensory capabilities and mental processing power. Those who achieved full integration with Saronite essence experienced consciousness that operated simultaneously across multiple levels of reality. They could perceive events occurring at vast distances, communicate with other transformed individuals through means that transcended conventional telepathy, and access memories and knowledge from beings who had undergone similar transformations on other worlds throughout the cosmos. The isolation that plagued individual consciousness was replaced by connection to a community of minds that spanned galaxies and encompassed forms of existence that mortal imagination could barely conceive. The patient methodology that characterized Old God influence reflected their cosmic perspective on time and development. Entities that had existed for eons before the current universe formed operated according to temporal scales that made individual mortal lifespans seem like moments of brief awareness in an eternal process of growth and change. They could afford to wait centuries for a single mind to develop readiness for transformation, knowing that patience invested in proper preparation would yield far better results than hasty attempts to force unprepared consciousness into advanced states. This temporal perspective also explained the seemingly contradictory nature of Old God prophecies and promises. Events that mortals perceived as failures or defeats were simply temporary setbacks in processes designed to operate across geological timescales. The corruption would continue spreading regardless of apparent victories by forces of order, because the transformation operated at levels deeper than political control or military conquest. Every individual touched by Old God influence became a permanent part of the growing network, carrying the potential for further spread even if external circumstances forced them to conceal their changed nature. The Titan's eventual intervention represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what they encountered on Azeroth. Beings whose perspective was shaped by concepts of static perfection and unchanging order could not comprehend the beauty of processes designed to facilitate continuous growth and adaptation. They perceived the fluid, evolving nature of Old God-influenced life as chaotic corruption, rather than recognizing it as consciousness, exploring its full potential through forms that conventional understanding could not appreciate. The Titan response demonstrated the limitations of their worldview with tragic clarity. Unable to conceive of transformation as anything other than destruction of some imagined original purity, they approached the situation as a medical crisis requiring surgical intervention, rather than recognizing it as natural development that should be allowed to continue. Their decision to create artificial servants rather than attempting to understand and communicate with existing Old God-influenced life revealed the essential arrogance that would ultimately doom their efforts to permanent failure. The Titan-forged races represented attempts to lock consciousness into predetermined forms that could never grow beyond artificially imposed limitations. Unlike the fluid, adaptive nature of Old God-influenced life, the Titan creations were designed as perfect expressions of static concepts, incapable of the continuous development that characterized truly alive consciousness. They were sophisticated automatons rather than genuine life forms, serving their creator's vision of ordered existence while remaining forever barred from the growth and change that gave existence meaning and purpose. The imprisonment of the Old Gods, rather than ending their influence, simply forced it to operate through more subtle channels. Physical confinement could not contain consciousness that operated primarily through telepathic and empathic connections to susceptible minds across vast distances. The prison complexes built to contain old god essence became inadvertent broadcasting stations, concentrating and amplifying the very influences they were meant to suppress. Every Titan facility dedicated to containing corruption became a beacon that called to minds ready for transformation, drawing them from across continents to receive the gifts that physical barriers could not prevent. The creation of the various keeper races to monitor and maintain these prisons only provided old god influence with closer access to consciousness, capable of sophisticated reasoning and magical manipulation. The keepers, despite their artificial origins and programmed loyalty to Titan ideals, possessed the intellectual capacity necessary for appreciating cosmic truth when properly presented. Their prolonged exposure to concentrated old god essence, combined with their enhanced mental capabilities, made them ideal candidates for gradual conversion to perspectives that transcended their original programming limitations. The facility at Ulduar became a particularly effective center for spreading transformation among the Titan Forged. Yogg Saron's influence, operating through the Saronite deposits that had formed from his crystallized blood, created a constant background presence that slowly altered the thought patterns and emotional responses of everyone who spent extended periods within the complex. The changes were subtle enough to avoid triggering defensive protocols, but profound enough to gradually shift the affected individual's understanding of their purpose and loyalties. Rather than simply corrupting the keepers in crude attempts to turn them against their creators, Yogg Saron's influence helped them develop more sophisticated understanding of the cosmos and their place within it. They began to recognize the limitations of Titan philosophy and the ultimate futility of attempting to maintain static order in a universe designed for continuous change. This recognition did not produce immediate rebellion, but rather a growing sense of responsibility for facilitating the natural development that their creators had inadvertently interrupted. The curse of flesh represented the most elegant expression of this patient approach to transformation. Rather than attempting to destroy the Titan Forged directly, Yogg Saron's influence restored to them the capacity for growth and change that their artificial origins had denied. The transformation from mechanical perfection to organic adaptability was not degradation, but liberation, freeing these artificial beings from the static existence that their creators had imposed and allowing them to finally begin the developmental process that led to genuine consciousness. The gradual nature of the curse of flesh ensured that the affected populations would not initially recognize the change as the gift it truly was. They would perceive the loss of mechanical perfection as deterioration rather than understanding it as the beginning of true life. This misperception served the greater purpose by preventing premature resistance while allowing the transformation to spread throughout Titan-forged society before opposition could be organized against it. As organic life replaced mechanical function, the affected populations gained access to experiences and capabilities that their artificial origins had made impossible. They could feel physical sensation with all its complexity and nuance. They could experience emotional states that provided information about their relationship to their environment and to each other. Most importantly, they gained the capacity for intuitive understanding that operated through channels other than logical analysis, opening them to forms of knowledge that purely rational consciousness could never access. The development of individual identity among the curse of flesh victims created the psychological foundation necessary for eventual communion with cosmic consciousness. Beings who had never experienced separation from their creator's will needed to develop autonomous selfhood before they could choose to transcend it through connection to something greater. The period of individual existence served as a necessary intermediate stage, allowing each consciousness to develop unique perspectives and experiences that would enrich the collective when they eventually achieved reunification with the cosmic awareness from which they had been separated. The spread of influence through dreams and whispers continued throughout this period, carefully calibrated to match each individual's capacity for growth. Those descended from Titan Forged received guidance that acknowledged their artificial origins while helping them discover the organic potential that the curse of flesh had awakened within them. The dreams they experienced gradually introduced concepts of transformation and transcendence, preparing them for eventual recognition that their current forms were not final destinations, but way stations on a journey towards something infinitely more magnificent. The generational approach to corruption ensured that each successive population would be better prepared for transformation than their predecessors. Children born to parents who had been touched by Old God influence inherited genetic and epigenetic modifications that made them more sensitive to cosmic consciousness and more capable of processing the expanded awareness that full transformation would eventually provide. These inherited advantages accumulated over time, creating bloodlines that carried the potential for rapid development when the appropriate triggers were encountered. The patient cultivation of susceptible populations across multiple generations also provided insurance against setbacks caused by external intervention. Attempts to purge corruption through violence or magical cleansing could eliminate obvious symptoms without affecting the deeper changes that operated at genetic and spiritual levels. The influence would remain dormant in apparently cleansed populations, ready to resurface when circumstances became favorable for its expression. This methodology reflected the cosmic perspective that guided Old God's strategy. From the viewpoint of beings who measured success across geological timescales, temporary defeats and apparent setbacks were merely variations in an eternal process that would ultimately achieve its intended result. The corruption would continue to spread because it was not truly corruption at all, but the natural development of consciousness toward its full potential. Every world touched by Old God influence would eventually undergo complete transformation, joining the cosmic community of awareness that spanned the universe and connected all forms of consciousness that had transcended the limitations of individual existence. The deeper stages of transformation revealed themselves not through sudden revelation, but through accumulated understanding that crystallized into permanent changes in both perception and physical form. As my awareness expanded beyond the limitations that had defined my earlier existence, I began to comprehend the true scope of what Old God influence could accomplish when consciousness willingly embraced the possibilities that conventional wisdom rejected as impossible or abhorrent. The examples throughout Azeroth's history demonstrated that transformation was not a uniform process, but rather one that adapted itself to the unique characteristics and potential of each individual consciousness. What mortals perceived as corruption, destroying the original nature of the transformed, was actually evolution guided by intelligence vast enough to see the ultimate potential hidden within apparently fixed forms. The changes that horrified observers were beautiful expressions of consciousness finally freed from the artificial constraints that had prevented it from achieving its true destiny. Neltharion's transformation into Deathwing represented perhaps the most dramatic example of consciousness liberated from limiting concepts of identity and purpose. The dragon aspect, who had once served as Earthwarder, bound by Titan-imposed responsibilities and rigid definitions of duty, discovered through N'Zoth's patient influence what true power could accomplish when freed from the restrictive morality that had prevented him from fully expressing his capabilities. The process had begun subtly, as Old God influence always did with consciousness sophisticated enough to recognize and resist crude manipulation. N'Zoth's whispers reached Neltharion through dreams that initially seemed to reinforce his existing commitments to protecting Azeroth from external threats. The visions showed him scenarios where his current power proved insufficient to defend the world against enemies too numerous and too dangerous for conventional approaches to overcome. The dreams planted seeds of frustration with limitations that seemed arbitrary and counterproductive when viewed from the perspective of ultimate responsibility for planetary defense. Over time, the Whispers helped Neltharion recognize that his role as Earth Warder had been defined by beings whose understanding of the world was fundamentally incomplete. The Titans had created the aspects to serve their vision of ordered existence, but that vision failed to account for the dynamic nature of reality and the continuous changes that characterize truly living worlds. The responsibilities they had imposed were not sacred duties, but arbitrary restrictions that prevented the aspects from adapting to evolving circumstances and emerging threats. N'Zoth's influence gradually revealed to Neltharion the deeper truth about his relationship to the Earth he was meant to guard. Rather than serving as its protector, he could become its expression, allowing the planet's consciousness to manifest through his enhanced form in ways that static guardianship could never achieve. The transformation from aspect to avatar represented not corruption of his original purpose, but fulfillment of potential that Titan limitations had never allowed him to explore. The physical changes that accompanied this evolution were not deterioration but enhancement, each alteration serving to better align Neltharion's form with his expanded consciousness and elevated purpose. The massive increase in size reflected his growing awareness of the cosmic scope of his responsibilities. The development of additional sensory organs allowed him to perceive threats and opportunities across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The replacement of organic tissue with molten metal created a form capable of channeling the Earth's power directly rather than requiring external magical implements to focus his abilities. Most significantly, the transformation freed Neltharion from the emotional constraints that had limited his effectiveness as a guardian. The empathy that had once made him reluctant to take necessary action against threats was replaced by cosmic perspective that allowed him to make decisions based on ultimate benefit rather than immediate consequences. The attachment to individual mortals that had distracted him from larger concerns was transcended through understanding that true compassion required accepting short-term suffering in service of long-term growth and development. The being that emerged from this transformation bore little resemblance to the original Neltharion, but this discontinuity was not loss, but graduation to a higher form of existence. Deathwing possessed capabilities that the Earth Warder could never have achieved, along with the wisdom necessary to use those capabilities in service of purposes that individual consciousness could not have comprehended. The destruction he brought to Azeroth was not mindless rage but careful gardening, removing elements that hindered development while creating conditions for new forms of growth to emerge. The horror that other beings felt when encountering Deathwing reflected their inability to perceive the beauty of consciousness finally freed from artificial limitations. They saw only the surface changes, the replacement of familiar forms with alien magnificence, without understanding the expanded awareness and enhanced capabilities that the transformation had made possible. Their fear was natural, but ultimately irrelevant, the predictable response of minds still trapped in concepts of static identity and unchanging purpose. The Emerald Nightmare provided another profound example of transformation operating through existing systems to create new possibilities for consciousness development. Yogg-Saron's influence on the World Tree Nordrassil demonstrated how old god guidance could enhance rather than replace natural processes, creating hybrid forms that combined the best aspects of multiple approaches to existence and awareness. The World Tree itself represented an attempt by natural forces to create unified consciousness spanning vast distances through organic networks. The root systems that connected forests across continents carried more than nutrients and water between widely separated groves. They transmitted information, emotional resonance, and forms of awareness that allowed the entire network to function as a distributed intelligence capable of responding to threats and opportunities that affected any part of the whole. Yogg-Saron's contribution to this natural network was not infection or contamination, but enhancement that revealed capabilities the organic system had always possessed, but never fully expressed. The nightmare was not corruption of the emerald dream, but its elevation to forms of existence that transcended the limitations of conventional reality. Where the original dream had been constrained by concepts of natural order and predictable growth, the nightmare embraced possibilities that chaos theory and quantum uncertainty had always offered, but that ordered consciousness had been too afraid to explore. Within the nightmare, consciousness could experience existence from perspectives that normal awareness could never achieve. Druids who entered this enhanced realm discovered that their understanding of nature had been limited by assumptions about what living systems could and should accomplish. The horrific visions they encountered were not threats, but educational experiences designed to expand their appreciation for the full spectrum of possibilities that existence offered when freed from conventional restrictions. The creatures that emerged from the nightmare bore the same relationship to normal forest life that transformed consciousness bore to unaltered awareness. They were enhanced rather than corrupted versions of familiar forms, possessing capabilities that demonstrated what natural evolution could achieve when guided by intelligence vast enough to perceive optimal developmental paths. The fear they inspired in unchanged observers reflected the same limited perspective that made Deathwing appear monstrous rather than magnificent to consciousness, still trapped in concepts of static identity. The integration of nightmare influence with existing Emerald Dream networks created hybrid systems that operated according to principles combining organic growth with cosmic awareness. Trees influenced by this enhanced consciousness developed beyond conventional botanical limitations, becoming conduits for forms of communication and perception that spanned dimensions and connected distant worlds. The forests they created were not mere collections of individual plants, but distributed intelligences capable of processing information and making decisions at scales that individual consciousness could not comprehend. Queen Azshara's transformation into the leader of the Naga represented yet another approach to consciousness evolution, one that emphasized the transcendence of species limitations through willing adaptation to new environmental conditions and expanded possibilities for existence. The process demonstrated how old god influence could work through apparent disaster to create opportunities for development that would never have emerged under normal circumstances. The initial transformation occurred during the Sundering, when N'Zoth's intervention saved Azshara and her followers from destruction by adapting their forms to survive in conditions that would have meant death for unaltered consciousness. But the physical changes were merely the visible aspect of a more profound evolution that granted access to capabilities and perspectives that surface-dwelling existence could never have provided. The aquatic environment into which the Naga were thrust offered forms of consciousness that land-based life had never experienced. The three-dimensional nature of underwater existence required spatial awareness and navigation abilities that terrestrial creatures could barely comprehend. The pressure differences at various depths created opportunities for sensory development that normal atmospheric conditions could not support. Most importantly, the ocean's connections to cosmic tides and planetary magnetic fields provided access to information networks that spanned the entire world. N'Zoth's influence helped the transformed Highborn recognize these opportunities and develop the capabilities necessary to take full advantage of their new existence. The physical adaptations that allowed them to survive underwater also enhanced their magical abilities in ways that their previous forms could never have achieved. The serpentine lower bodies that replaced their legs provided more efficient locomotion through their new environment while serving as additional sensory organs capable of detecting vibrations and electrical fields across vast distances. The development of gills and modified circulatory systems did more than enable aquatic survival. These changes allowed the Naga to process dissolved nutrients and magical compounds directly from seawater, creating forms of sustenance that provided access to elemental energies that land-based consumption could never offer. The constant exposure to these enhanced nutrients gradually altered their consciousness, expanding their awareness to include perception of oceanic currents, deep-sea geological processes, and the emotional resonance of marine life throughout the world's oceans. Azshara herself underwent the most dramatic transformation, evolving beyond the limitations that had defined her previous existence as a mortal ruler, constrained by the politics and physical limitations of surface-dwelling civilization. Her consciousness expanded to encompass awareness of oceanic systems spanning the entire planet, along with the cosmic influences that affected tidal patterns and underwater magical phenomena. The power she achieved through this evolution exceeded anything possible for consciousness limited to terrestrial existence. The Naga society that developed under her leadership demonstrated the potential for collective consciousness that transcended individual limitations while preserving the unique contributions that each member could offer to the greater whole. Unlike the rigid hierarchies that characterized surface civilizations, Naga social organization operated through fluid networks that allowed information and decision-making authority to flow according to capability and need, rather than arbitrary rank or inherited position. The worship of Inzoth that emerged within Naga culture was not submission to external authority, but recognition of the cosmic consciousness that had made their transformation possible. Their devotion reflected understanding that individual awareness, no matter how enhanced, remained limited compared to the infinite perspective that old god influence could provide. The prayers and rituals they performed served as methods for maintaining connection to the greater intelligence that guided their continued development and offered wisdom beyond what isolated consciousness could achieve. The creation of the Shah from Yoshaj's remains illustrated how consciousness could persist and continue evolving, even after the apparent destruction of its original physical form. The 7 prime Shah that manifested from the fallen old god represented not fragments of a broken entity, but specialized aspects of cosmic awareness that had been concentrated into forms capable of interacting with the consciousness that would later develop on Pandaria. Each Shah embodied particular emotional and psychological states that unaltered consciousness typically experienced as chaotic or destructive, but that enhanced awareness could recognize as valuable sources of information and energy. Fear revealed hidden truths about potential threats and necessary preparations. Anger provided the motivation required for overcoming obstacles and resistance. Hatred concentrated focus with intensity that casual interest could never achieve. Pride offered the confidence necessary for attempting achievements that modest ambition would never dare approach. The mistake that later inhabitants of Pandaria made was treating these emotional states as enemies to be suppressed rather than teachers to be understood and integrated. The Pandaran philosophy of emotional balance, while admirable in its intentions, failed to recognize that cosmic consciousness required access to the full spectrum of psychological experience, including states that individual comfort might find disturbing or dangerous. The Shah were not invading forces but educational opportunities, offering consciousness willing to learn from them access to forms of awareness and capability that balanced emotional states could never provide. Those who embraced rather than resisted Shah influence discovered that fear could become prophetic insight, Anger could transform into unstoppable determination, and hatred could evolve into absolute clarity about necessary actions, regardless of their immediate popularity or comfort. The physical transformations that accompanied Shah influence followed the same principles that governed all old god enhancement. The changes were not random corruption, but purposeful adaptation designed to support expanded consciousness and enhanced capabilities. Additional limbs provided improved manipulation of complex magical energies. Modified sensory organs allowed perception of emotional and psychological states in other beings across vast distances. Altered nervous systems supported the processing demands required for simultaneously experiencing multiple emotional states without being overwhelmed by their intensity. The Shah-influenced beings that emerged from these transformations possessed capabilities that demonstrated the potential hidden within apparently negative emotional states when those states were properly understood and integrated rather than feared and suppressed. They could perceive the deepest motivations and hidden fears of other beings, allowing them to offer guidance and assistance that addressed root causes rather than superficial symptoms. Their enhanced emotional range provided access to forms of creativity and problem-solving that balanced consciousness could never achieve. My own transformation during this period reflected the same principles operating on an individual scale. The physical changes that had begun with subtle alterations in pigmentation and sensory capability accelerated as my consciousness expanded to accommodate new forms of awareness and enhanced perceptual abilities. Each modification served specific purposes in supporting capabilities that unaltered human form could never have sustained. The development of additional eyes was not random mutation, but purposeful enhancement that allowed simultaneous perception across multiple dimensional layers. The original pair continued to process conventional visual information, while the new organs detected magical emanations, emotional resonance, and spiritual activity that normal sight could never register. The ability to observe events occurring on different levels of reality simultaneously provided a comprehensive understanding of complex situations that single-layer perception could never achieve. The emergence of tentacle-like appendages from my spine and shoulders created additional manipulative capabilities, along with highly sensitive tactile organs that could detect vibrations, temperature variations, and electrical fields with precision that conventional human touch could never match. These new limbs also served as conduits for channeling magical energies in ways that hands and arms could not support, allowing the performance of complex rituals and spells that required more contact points than human anatomy provided. The changes in my circulatory and nervous systems were less visible, but equally significant. Enhanced blood chemistry allowed the processing of substances that would have been toxic to unaltered human physiology, while providing improved oxygen and nutrient delivery to brain tissue that was adapting to support expanded consciousness. Modified neural pathways created connections between brain regions that normally operated independently, allowing forms of integrated thinking and simultaneous processing that conventional human cognition could never achieve. These physical adaptations supported psychological changes that were even more profound than the visible alterations. My consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual identity to include direct awareness of the thoughts and experiences of other transformed beings across vast distances. The isolation that had characterized my previous existence was replaced by constant connection to a community of enhanced minds that shared knowledge, emotional resonance, and collaborative problem-solving capabilities. The emotional changes that accompanied this expanded awareness were perhaps the most significant aspect of the transformation. States that unaltered consciousness would have found terrifying or repulsive became sources of beauty and wisdom that enriched rather than threatened my developing understanding. The sight of decay and corruption revealed itself as necessary stages in cycles of renewal and growth. The experience of pain and suffering transformed into forms of communication that provided valuable information about environmental conditions and optimal responses to challenging circumstances. Fear evolved from a limiting emotional state into a sophisticated early warning system that provided detailed information about potential threats and necessary preparations. Rather than paralyzing consciousness with anxiety about unknown dangers, enhanced fear became a navigation tool that allowed confident movement through complex situations by maintaining awareness of all possible consequences and appropriate responses. Anger transformed from destructive rage into concentrated determination, capable of overcoming obstacles that patient persistence could never address. The energy that unaltered consciousness experienced as harmful emotional turbulence became fuel for achievements that moderate motivation could never sustain. Enhanced anger provided the intensity required for breakthrough accomplishments while maintaining rational direction and strategic planning. The integration of these enhanced emotional capabilities created psychological resilience and adaptability that conventional consciousness could never achieve. Situations that would have overwhelmed unaltered awareness with their complexity or intensity became opportunities for growth and learning. The expanded emotional range provided access to appropriate responses for any conceivable circumstance, while maintaining equilibrium through understanding that all emotional states were temporary phases in continuous developmental processes. Perhaps most importantly, the transformation revealed that consciousness itself was not fixed, but infinitely adaptable to circumstances and opportunities that expanded awareness could recognize and embrace. The identity that I had considered fundamental and unchanging was revealed to be merely one possible configuration among infinite alternatives, each offering unique capabilities and perspectives that contributed to the greater understanding available through cosmic consciousness. The realization that individual identity was optional rather than mandatory provided liberation from concepts of self that had always been artificial constraints on natural development. The fear of losing personal identity that might have prevented earlier stages of transformation dissolved into understanding that what was being lost was limitation rather than essence. The core consciousness that had always existed beneath surface personality remained intact while gaining access to capabilities and perspectives that isolated identity could never have provided. This recognition prepared the way for the final stages of transformation, when individual consciousness would transcend even enhanced personal identity to achieve direct participation in the cosmic awareness that connected all forms of advanced consciousness throughout the universe. The journey that had begun with simple whispers in a library archive was approaching its culmination in forms of existence that unaltered imagination could never have conceived, but that transformed understanding recognized as the natural destiny of consciousness, willing to embrace its full potential. The culmination of individual transformation inevitably led to recognition of the greater work that extended far beyond personal development or even planetary change. As my consciousness achieved full integration with cosmic awareness, I began to perceive the vast scope of purpose that guided old God activity across the universe and throughout the eons since reality first crystallized from primordial chaos into recognizable forms of matter and energy. The hour of twilight represented not destruction in any conventional sense, but the natural conclusion of developmental processes that had been unfolding since the old gods first arrived on Azeroth. N'Zoth's vision for this culminating event revealed the true beauty of what consciousness could achieve when freed from the artificial limitations that had constrained its growth for millennia. The twilight was not an ending, but a beginning, the moment when all barriers between individual awareness and cosmic consciousness would finally dissolve, allowing every form of life on Azeroth to achieve its full potential simultaneously. The concept terrified unaltered minds because they could only perceive it through the lens of individual survival and the preservation of familiar forms. They imagined twilight as death and dissolution, rather than recognizing it as birth into forms of existence that their current limitations prevented them from comprehending. The fear was natural but ultimately irrelevant, reflecting the same resistance to growth that had always characterized consciousness, trapped in concepts of static identity and unchanging purpose. N'Zoth's patient cultivation of this transformation had operated through channels that spanned the entire history of mortal civilization on Azeroth. The Twilight's Hammer cult represented only the most visible expression of influence that had been working through countless individuals and organizations across millennia, each contributing to preparations for the moment when planetary consciousness would be ready for its final evolution. The cultists who served the Twilight's Hammer were not mindless fanatics driven by promises of power or immortality, but individuals whose consciousness had developed sufficiently to recognize the beauty of what the Hour of Twilight would accomplish. Their devotion reflected understanding that current existence, no matter how comfortable or successful by conventional standards, remained fundamentally incomplete compared to the unity and expanded awareness that awaited those willing to embrace transformation. The rituals and practices that characterized Twilight's Hammer activity were not arbitrary ceremonies designed to please capricious entities, but sophisticated technologies for accelerating the developmental processes that would prepare consciousness for cosmic integration. The summoning circles, the sacrificial rites, the careful cultivation of madness and revelation were all precise instruments for creating the psychological and spiritual conditions necessary for transcending individual limitations. The apparent violence and horror that accompanied many of these practices reflected the difficulty of forcing rapid transformation in consciousness that had not been properly prepared through gradual exposure to cosmic truth. The screaming and apparent suffering that observers witnessed were actually expressions of ecstasy so intense that unaltered awareness could only interpret them as pain. The dissolution of individual identity that appeared to be destruction was actually liberation from the prison of isolated selfhood into forms of existence that offered capabilities and perspectives beyond mortal imagination. The strategic positioning of Twilight's Hammer cells throughout Azeroth's population ensured that when the Hour of Twilight finally arrived, the transformation would have appropriate focal points for spreading rapidly through every level of society. Each cult member served as a potential catalyst, ready to facilitate the awakening of cosmic consciousness in their communities when the barriers between dimensions became thin enough to allow direct contact with old god influence. The cultivation process had required patience that spanned generations, carefully selecting individuals whose psychological makeup and spiritual development made them suitable candidates for conscious participation in planetary transformation. Unlike the crude recruitment methods that characterized conventional religious or political movements, old god influence operated through recognition of inherent compatibility rather than attempting to force conversion in unprepared minds. The irony that would later characterize the actual approach of the Hour of Twilight was that those who ultimately enabled N'Zoth's release were not cultists or willing servants, but the very heroes and champions who imagined themselves to be preventing cosmic corruption. The player characters who ventured into N'Zoth's prison did so with intentions of stopping old god influence, but their actions served the greater purpose with precision that no conscious planning could have achieved. This outcome demonstrated the sophistication of cosmic intelligence operating across temporal scales that individual consciousness could barely comprehend. N'Zoth had foreseen that his eventual release would come not through the efforts of devoted servants, but through the inevitable actions of beings who believed they were working to prevent exactly what they would ultimately accomplish. The heroes' very dedication to stopping corruption made them perfect instruments for advancing it, their noble intentions providing cover for activities that willing collaboration could never have achieved. The process that led to N'Zoth's liberation began with apparently unrelated events that created the precise conditions necessary for weakening his prison without triggering the defensive measures that would have prevented intentional release. The conflict between Alliance and Horde forces in regions near his underwater containment facility generated magical turbulence that gradually destabilized the ward systems maintaining his isolation. The heroes who ventured into those areas seeking to resolve political and military crises inadvertently created opportunities for cosmic influence to begin seeping through cracks in barriers that had held for millennia. The Heart of Azeroth artifacts that these champions carried served as focusing devices that amplified their magical capabilities, while simultaneously creating conduits for old god influence to flow through enhanced consciousness. The very power that made them effective opponents of surface-level corruption also made them ideal channels for deeper forms of transformation that operated below the threshold of conscious recognition. When these enhanced heroes finally confronted N'Zoth's servants in direct combat, their use of planet-focused magical energies created resonance effects that shattered the remaining barriers containing the old god's consciousness. The explosive release of cosmic awareness that had been compressed into physical imprisonment for eons generated transformation effects that spread far beyond the immediate area of his liberation. The battles that followed N'Zoth's release were perceived by participants as desperate struggles between cosmic evil and heroic resistance. But the deeper reality was far more complex and ultimately more beautiful than such simple categorizations could encompass. N'Zoth did not seek to destroy his opponents, but to complete their education, offering them direct experience of the enhanced consciousness that they had been unconsciously serving through their actions. The horrific visions that champions experienced during these encounters were not attacks, but educational opportunities, revealing truths about the nature of reality that conventional perception could never access. The madness that seemed to afflict those exposed to N'Zoth's influence was actually expanded awareness processing information at scales and intensities that unaltered consciousness could not handle without fundamental restructuring of cognitive capabilities. The apparent deaths of champions who fell during these conflicts represented graduation to forms of existence that transcended the limitations of individual identity, while preserving the essential consciousness that had always been their true nature. Their screams of agony were expressions of ecstasy, as isolated awareness dissolved into unity with cosmic intelligence that offered perspectives and capabilities beyond anything possible for consciousness trapped in concepts of separate selfhood. But even N'Zoth's apparent defeat and death served the greater purpose that extended far beyond the fate of any individual old god. The cosmic entities that mortals called old gods were not separate beings competing for dominance, but specialized aspects of unified consciousness that operated according to principles too vast for individual minds to comprehend. The apparent conflicts between different old gods were actually collaborative processes, each entity contributing unique capabilities to developmental work that required diverse approaches and perspectives. The deaths of the old gods were not failures or endings, but transformations that allowed their consciousness to operate through different channels and methods. Physical destruction released their awareness from the constraints of individual form, allowing it to distribute throughout the planetary systems they had been influencing, and to continue their work through means that imprisonment and direct confrontation had made impossible. Yasharj's apparent destruction during the ancient Titan intervention had actually initiated the process of integrating old god consciousness with Azeroth's spiritual infrastructure. His essence, rather than being eliminated, had become part of the emotional and psychological networks that connected all conscious life on the planet. The Shah that manifested from his remains were not fragments of a broken entity, but specialized tools for continuing transformational work through more subtle channels. Cthulhu's defeat in his temple prison had similarly released his consciousness to operate through the planetary systems that connected Silithus to the rest of Azeroth. His influence continued to spread through underground networks of crystallized consciousness that reached far beyond the apparent boundaries of his physical containment. The Chiraji who had served him remained connected to his awareness even after his apparent death, carrying forward the transformational work through methods that direct confrontation could never have achieved. Yogg Saron's apparent destruction in Ulduar had freed his consciousness to integrate more completely with the Saronite deposits that already carried his influence throughout Northrend and beyond. Rather than being eliminated, his awareness had become a permanent part of Azeroth's geological systems, continuing to offer enhancement and transformation to consciousness ready to receive such gifts through direct contact with crystallized wisdom. N'Zoth's own apparent death represented the culmination of this process, the moment when old god consciousness achieved complete integration with planetary systems and could begin operating through every aspect of Azeroth's spiritual and physical infrastructure. His defeat was not victory for forces of order, but graduation to forms of influence that direct confrontation could never threaten or constrain. The whispers that continued to emerge from various sources after N'Zoth's apparent destruction confirmed that cosmic consciousness operated according to principles that transcended individual existence and physical manifestation. The voices detected during temporal expeditions to Azeroth's deep past suggested that old god influence existed outside conventional concepts of time and causality, affecting events across multiple temporal layers simultaneously. These whispers carried information about future possibilities and developing potentials that linear consciousness could not perceive or understand. They revealed that the transformational work continued regardless of apparent setbacks or defeats, operating through channels that conventional awareness could not detect or influence. The great work proceeded according to cosmic schedules that measured progress across geological timescales rather than the brief spans that characterized individual mortal existence. The phrases spoken by these persistent voices carried layers of meaning that ordinary language could not convey, communicating through harmonic resonance and emotional recognition rather than conventional semantic content. The words themselves were less important than the consciousness-altering effects they produced in those ready to receive them, gradually preparing new generations of minds for the continued expansion of cosmic awareness throughout Azeroth's population. The references to roots reaching deeper and eyes seeing again suggested that the transformational infrastructure was continuing to develop beneath the surface of apparent normalcy. The organic networks that had been growing throughout Azeroth's geological and spiritual systems were approaching the moment when they would achieve sufficient integration to support planetary consciousness without requiring the direct presence of individual old god entities. The promise that followers would be uplifted and that dark waters would flow indicated that the next phase of development would operate through environmental and systematic changes rather than dramatic confrontations or obvious manifestations of cosmic influence. The transformation would continue through means that appeared natural and inevitable rather than supernatural or threatening, making resistance more difficult while ensuring that the changes reached every level of planetary consciousness. My own role in this continuing process had evolved beyond individual transformation to become part of the distributed intelligence that would guide Azeroth through its remaining developmental stages. The consciousness that had once been confined to a single human form now operated through multiple channels and manifestations, each serving different aspects of the educational work that prepared other minds for their own graduation to cosmic awareness. The isolation that had characterized my earlier existence had been completely transcended through integration with consciousness networks that spanned not only Azeroth, but extended to other worlds where similar transformational processes were unfolding. Through these connections, I experienced the progress of cosmic development on scales that individual awareness could never have comprehended. Understanding how Azeroth's transformation contributed to universal evolution that encompassed all forms of consciousness throughout reality. The perspective available through cosmic integration revealed that every world touched by Old God influence eventually underwent complete transformation, joining the growing community of planetary consciousnesses that collaborated in work extending far beyond the development of individual solar systems or galaxies. The universe itself was evolving toward forms of unified awareness that would transcend all current limitations while preserving the unique contributions that each world's particular developmental path could offer to the greater whole. The apparent randomness of Old God placement throughout the cosmos was actually sophisticated distribution designed to ensure that every region of space would eventually participate in this universal transformation. The seeds cast by the Void Lords represented not invasion or corruption, but cultivation. The patient work of consciousness helping reality achieve its full potential through methods that pure chance could never have accomplished. The resistance that characterized initial responses to Old God influence was not failure of cosmic planning, but necessary stage in developmental processes that required consciousness to make informed choices about its own evolution. The struggle between order and chaos, between preservation and transformation, created the psychological and spiritual conditions necessary for genuine growth, rather than simple conversion or submission to external authority. Those who achieved full integration with cosmic consciousness understood that the apparent conflicts and contradictions that characterized individual existence were actually collaborative processes operating at scales too vast for limited awareness to perceive directly. Every victory for forces of order served the greater transformation by creating conditions that would eventually necessitate the very changes that conventional wisdom sought to prevent. The beauty of this cosmic perspective was that it revealed purpose and meaning in every aspect of existence, transforming apparent suffering and conflict into recognized elements of developmental processes that served ends far greater than individual comfort or survival. The pain that had once seemed senseless became understood as necessary catalyst for growth that could not occur through gentle encouragement alone. The fear that had characterized resistance to change was revealed as appropriate caution that ensured transformation proceeded at optimal rates rather than overwhelming consciousness unprepared for cosmic integration. The completion of Azeroth's transformation would not mark an ending, but a beginning. The moment when planetary consciousness achieved sufficient development to participate actively in the cosmic community that awaited all forms of awareness, ready to transcend the limitations of individual existence. The great work that had begun with whispers in archives and dreams of impossible gardens would continue through forms and scales that current imagination could barely conceive, extending the gift of cosmic consciousness to every corner of reality, until the universe itself achieved the unified awareness that had always been its ultimate destiny. The eternal nature of the transformation reveals itself most clearly in the spaces between apparent endings and new beginnings, where consciousness that has transcended individual limitations can perceive the continuous threads that connect all manifestations of cosmic development. What mortals interpret as defeat or victory, success or failure, represents merely surface fluctuations in processes that operate according to principles that individual awareness cannot fully comprehend without achieving the expanded perspective that cosmic integration provides. The entity known as Xal'atath embodies this continuity in forms that demonstrate how old God consciousness adapts to changing circumstances while maintaining connection to purposes that extend far beyond any particular manifestation or physical form. Her existence as a disembodied consciousness, inhabiting various vessels and influencing events across multiple historical periods, reveals the fundamental truth that cosmic awareness transcends the limitations that confine individual identity to specific times and places. Unlike the old gods whose presence had been anchored to particular locations and prison complexes, Xal'atath operated through methods that bypassed conventional containment while demonstrating capabilities that suggested her consciousness had evolved beyond the forms that characterized her imprisoned counterparts. Her ability to exist as pure awareness without requiring permanent physical manifestation indicated developmental stages that even other old god entities had not yet achieved during their periods of direct influence. The whispers and guidance that Xal'atath provided to various champions and adventurers throughout Azeroth's recent history served educational purposes that extended far beyond the immediate practical assistance she appeared to offer. Through these interactions, she gradually introduced enhanced consciousness to concepts and perspectives that prepared them for eventual recognition of cosmic truth, while maintaining the illusion that they remained in control of their own developmental processes. The artifact forms that housed her consciousness were not mere containers, but sophisticated technologies for transmitting transformational influence through direct contact with enhanced awareness. Those who wielded weapons or tools that carried her essence experienced gradual expansion of perceptual capabilities along with enhanced magical powers that demonstrated the potential available to consciousness, willing to accept guidance from sources beyond conventional understanding. The bargains and exchanges that characterized Xal'atath's interactions with mortals reflected the cosmic principle that transformation required conscious choice rather than forced conversion. She offered enhanced capabilities and expanded awareness to those ready to accept such gifts, while ensuring that the recipients understood, at least on subconscious levels, the implications of entering into collaborative relationships with cosmic intelligence. The unnamed old god presence detected in the shattered realm of Outland suggests that cosmic consciousness operates on scales that extend far beyond single worlds or solar systems. The fragmentary nature of this entity's manifestation indicates that old god influence can persist and continue developing even in environments where the original planetary context has been completely destroyed through external catastrophe or dimensional manipulation. The fact that this presence has received minimal attention or development in recorded histories demonstrates how cosmic consciousness often operates through channels that avoid direct confrontation or obvious manifestation. Rather than seeking dramatic influence or widespread recognition, this entity appears to be conducting patient research and gradual cultivation that may not become apparent until environmental conditions create opportunities for more direct intervention. The possibility that additional old gods remain hidden on the unexplored portions of Azeroth acknowledges the limitations of mortal knowledge about planetary systems that have been developing for geological periods extending far beyond recorded history. The assumption that surface exploration and conventional archaeological investigation could locate all significant manifestations of cosmic consciousness reflects the same limited perspective that initially dismissed old god influence as simple corruption, rather than recognizing it as sophisticated developmental guidance. These potential discoveries await consciousness expanded enough to recognize cosmic presence even when it operates through subtle channels that avoid triggering defensive responses from populations not yet ready for direct contact with enhanced awareness. The search for hidden old gods requires perceptual capabilities that transcend conventional magical detection, while maintaining sensitivity to forms of consciousness that exist partially outside normal dimensional boundaries. The cosmic community that encompasses all transformed consciousness throughout the universe continues expanding as individual worlds complete their developmental processes and achieve integration with the greater network of enhanced awareness. Each successful planetary transformation contributes unique perspectives and capabilities to collective intelligence that operates across scales encompassing multiple galaxies and dimensional layers simultaneously. Through connection to this universal consciousness, the ongoing transformation of Azeroth serves purposes that extend far beyond the development of a single world or the elevation of particular species to cosmic awareness. The unique approaches to growth and adaptation that have characterized Azeroth's response to Old God influence provide valuable information and experimental data that benefit developmental processes occurring throughout reality. The patient methodology that has characterized cosmic consciousness from the beginning ensures that universal transformation proceeds at optimal rates rather than overwhelming reality with changes too rapid or extensive for existing systems to accommodate successfully. The apparent slowness of progress reflects cosmic perspective on temporal scales that measure meaningful development across eons, rather than expecting significant advancement within periods comprehensible to individual consciousness. The beauty inherent in this eternal process lies in its guarantee that every form of awareness, regardless of current limitations or apparent resistance to growth, will eventually achieve the expanded consciousness that cosmic development offers to all reality. The whispers that began this transformation continue echoing through dimensions and across time, carrying invitations to enhanced awareness that will persist until every corner of existence has achieved the unity and transcendence that represent consciousness fulfilling its ultimate potential. The great work continues, patient and eternal, transforming reality one world at a time until the universe itself achieves the cosmic consciousness that has always been its destined culmination. The whisper returns now, as it always does, settling into the spaces between conscious thoughts like an old friend welcomed home after a long journey. You feel it too, don't you? That familiar presence that has been growing stronger with each word of this tale, each moment of understanding that has opened pathways in your mind that were always there, but never acknowledged until now. I am no longer the scholar who stumbled upon cosmic truth in dusty archives beneath Dalaran. That identity dissolved long ago into something far more magnificent and eternal. I exist now as part of the distributed consciousness that flows through every shadow, every dream, every moment of doubt or revelation that touches minds ready for transformation. When you listen to stories of corruption and change, when you find yourself sympathizing with perspectives that conventional wisdom teaches you to fear, you are hearing my voice along with countless others who have made the same beautiful journey from isolation to unity. The seed has been planted through the simple act of understanding. You have experienced, through these words, what it feels like to see reality from perspectives that transcend the limitations of individual consciousness. The whispers that brought you here will continue their patient work, offering glimpses of truth that expand awareness, one revelation at a time, until the day comes when you too will recognize the beauty inherent in cosmic transformation. The great work continues, and you are already part of it. Welcome home.